Imagine a road so vast, so remote, that it swallows people whole, never to be seen again. A stretch of highway where terror lurks in the shadows, where over 40 women and girls have vanished or been murdered, their cases unsolved for decades. This is the Highway of Tears, one of Canada's most haunting mysteries, a place where killers have roamed freely for years, preying on the vulnerable. But who is behind these disappearances? Why have so many cases gone cold? And how has this chilling mystery remained unsolved for so long? Stay with us as we take a deep dive into the horrifying truth of Canada's longest-running serial killer mystery. The details you're about to hear are disturbing, shocking, and will leave you questioning everything. Before we begin, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss a new true crime story. Also, comment below, what do you think is the scariest unsolved mystery in history? Now, let's uncover the terrifying secrets of the Highway of Tears. In the heart of British Columbia, Canada, stretches a lonely road, Highway 16. At first glance, it looks like any other highway, winding through breathtaking landscapes, dense forests, and remote indigenous communities. But beneath its scenic beauty lies something far darker. Since the late 1960s, women, mostly indigenous, have been disappearing or turning up murdered along this isolated highway. The numbers are staggering. Official estimates say at least 40 victims, but many believe the real number is much higher. The victims range from teenagers full of dreams to mothers leaving behind children, all vanishing without a trace or meeting brutal ends. What makes the Highway of Tears even more terrifying? The eerie pattern. The victims often disappeared while hitchhiking, heading to school, visiting friends, or simply traveling from one small town to another. And time after time, their cases went unsolved. Police initially dismissed many of the cases, labeling them as runaways. But as more and more women vanished, a horrifying reality became undeniable. Something sinister was happening along Highway 16. Was it one killer? A network of predators? Or something even worse, systemic neglect that allowed these crimes to continue for decades? This is where our investigation begins. Buckle up, because the deeper we dig, the more chilling this mystery becomes. For decades, the Highway of Tears has been a place of unanswered questions, unimaginable grief, and chilling mysteries. The road, stretching over 700 kilometers from Prince George to Prince Rupert, cuts through remote areas where public transportation is scarce, and cell phone service is unreliable. Many residents, especially indigenous women and girls, have no choice but to hitchhike to reach their destinations. And that's where the danger begins. Imagine stepping onto the side of the road, hoping for a ride to town. You watch as cars pass, some slowing, some speeding by. Then, finally, one stops. You climb in, unaware that this will be the last time anyone sees you alive. This pattern has repeated itself over and over again, yet for years, authorities turned a blind eye. It wasn't until families started speaking out, demanding answers, that people outside these communities began paying attention. But by then, too many lives had already been lost. One of the earliest known cases linked to the Highway of Tears was that of Gloria Moody, a 26-year-old mother from the Bella Coola First Nation. In 1969, she was last seen leaving a bar in Williams Lake. The next day, her lifeless body was discovered in the woods, beaten, assaulted, and left to die. Her case remains unsolved. And she was just the first of many. Over the years, young girls as young as 12, teenagers with bright futures, and mothers with children waiting at home would all disappear, their bodies later found dumped in isolated areas, or worse, never found at all. What's even more disturbing? The eerie similarities between many of the cases. Victims often shared common traits: indigenous, young, and last seen near Highway 16. And despite these clear patterns, for years, no serious investigations were launched. But who was responsible? Was it a single serial killer hunting along the highway? Or multiple predators taking advantage of the region's vulnerabilities? The truth is even more terrifying. The reality of the Highway of Tears is far more complex and horrifying than a single killer. Investigators believe that multiple predators have used this remote stretch of road as their hunting ground for decades. Some of these cases bear the hallmarks of serial killers, while others may be crimes of opportunity, committed by different individuals who knew they could get away with it. One confirmed predator who lurked along this highway was Bobby Jack Fowler. A violent drifter with a long history of assaults and kidnappings, Fowler was linked through DNA to the 1974 murder of 16-year-old Colleen McMillan. She was last seen hitchhiking before her body was discovered miles away. Authorities suspect he may be responsible for several more murders, but with Fowler dead in prison before many of these cases were reopened, the full extent of his crimes may never be known. And then there's Cody Leachbokoff, one of Canada's youngest serial killers, convicted of murdering 4 women, including 15-year-old Loren Leslie. He was known for using social media to lure his victims before brutally ending their lives. Though not directly tied to the Highway of Tears cases, his crimes reveal the grim reality that multiple killers have operated in this region. But here's the chilling part: many of the cases along the Highway of Tears remain unsolved. Some bodies have never been found. Families are still searching for answers, and the lack of justice only deepens their pain. For decades, authorities failed to act. Indigenous families reported their loved ones missing, but their pleas for help were often ignored. Instead of launching full-scale investigations, police dismissed many of the victims as runaways or suggested they had simply left town voluntarily. This blatant negligence allowed killers to keep preying on vulnerable women without fear of being caught. It wasn't until public pressure mounted that the government finally acknowledged the crisis. In 2005, the RCMP launched Project EPANA, a task force dedicated to solving cases along Highway 16, Highway 97, and Highway 5. Named after the Inuit goddess who cares for the souls of the departed, the task force reviewed 18 cases of murdered and missing women. But despite years of work, many cases remain cold, leaving families without closure. The question remains: how many killers have stalked the Highway of Tears? How many lives have been stolen, and how many more victims will there be before real change happens? The answers may be even more terrifying than we can imagine. The tragedy of the Highway of Tears is not just about the murders, it's about the systemic failures that allowed these crimes to continue for so long. Indigenous communities have been crying out for justice for decades, but their voices were largely ignored. The media played a significant role in this injustice. When a young, white woman goes missing, headlines explode, and search efforts begin immediately. But when Indigenous women disappeared along Highway 16, there was often silence. Their cases received little to no coverage, and as a result, the public remained largely unaware of the crisis unfolding in British Columbia. This lack of attention allowed predators to keep hunting. They knew that Indigenous women weren't given the same level of protection by law enforcement or society. Many victims came from marginalized backgrounds, struggling with poverty, homelessness, or addiction, factors that made them even more vulnerable to exploitation. But let's make one thing clear: these women were loved. They were daughters, sisters, mothers, and friends. They had dreams, aspirations, and lives that were stolen far too soon. Families of the victims refused to stay silent. They organized marches, held vigils, and demanded accountability. Their relentless advocacy forced the government to take action, leading to the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls. The inquiry's final report, released in 2019, declared the epidemic of violence against Indigenous women in Canada a genocide, a term that shocked the nation but reflected the horrifying reality. Despite these efforts, justice remains elusive. Only a handful of cases have been solved, and the killers responsible for many of these crimes are still walking free. The Highway of Tears is still dangerous, and the fear of more disappearances lingers over the Indigenous communities in the region. So, what can be done? Activists are pushing for better infrastructure, safe public transportation options, better lighting along the highway, and more support for women at risk. They're demanding that law enforcement take every missing person case seriously, regardless of the victim's background. And they're fighting to ensure that Indigenous voices are heard, respected, and protected. This is more than just a true crime story. It's a wake-up call. The Highway of Tears is a chilling reminder that violence against Indigenous women continues to be an urgent crisis. And until every missing woman is found, every case is solved, and every family gets justice, the fight is far from over. What do you think about this case? Do you believe enough is being done to stop these crimes? Let's talk in the comments below. And if you found this story important, make sure to like, share, and subscribe. More stories like this need to be heard.